Now, delivering the third quarter crime stats, Police Minister Becky Cele said there has been a decline in the murder rate. 6,945 murders have been recorded from July to September. 881 of the victims were women, while 293 murders were of children. To unpack the figures, we speak now to the senior researcher for the Criminal Justice Reform Program at the Dullah Omar Institute in Africa, Dr Jean Redpath. Thank you for making time for us, Dr. Redpath. So whenever these stats are released and you see the numbers, one often wonders if we're losing this war against crime. Sometimes even when you see a decline in the numbers, it's not significant enough. So are we losing our fight against crime?
Well, certainly, we've got to look at the long term. Over the long term, when we look at the picture for South Africa as a whole, we had a sustained period where we were winning the fight against crime, and that was up until about 2010, 2011. We went from an exceptionally high murder rate of around 60 per 100,000 down to about 30 per 100,000. So we almost halved the murder rate in quite a short time. However, after that, we started to see a slow but steady rise up until the lockdown period. In lockdown, we had an anomalous period, and immediately after lockdown, a quite a scary and rapid rise. So we are now again in the territory of around 45 per 100,000. So in other words, we've lost half of the gains that we made since 1994 up until this moment.
So the murder of women and children saw a significant decrease. I mean, even though the overall numbers are still staggering, should we be cautiously hopeful here, looking at the decrease in the numbers?
So the decrease in the numbers, when you're dealing with quite small numbers, which is what we are dealing with women and children. So it was 108 fewer murders of women and 22 fewer murders of children. That can easily happen over a 3-time period and not really 3-month time period and not really indicate anything significant. Furthermore, if you look directly below murders, we have our other serious crimes which can lead to murder if serious, if bad enough. So, for example, attempted murder increased by 18%. So one could say, well, of that increase, so those attempts weren't converted into murder, but they show that the underlying violence which leads to those crimes is still prevalent, and that in all likelihood those numbers are not indicative of a new trend. Well, there's not enough. There haven't been significantly many periods of a reduction for there to be a trend to speak of.
Okay. Could the other possibility be that there are cases that are not being reported, or that the police are beginning to do something right when you look at their strategy?
So when it comes to murder, in our urban areas, we can be pretty certain that that murder is being reported. I'm not so certain about some of our deep rural areas that all our murders are being reported. This is particularly so when you compare to estimates from our public health authorities, which are showing somewhat higher figures than are reported by SAPS in areas like Limpopo. So generally we say that murder is pretty reliable. The other figures are entirely dependent on the extent to which people are choosing to report them. And there are many reasons why people might choose not to report. And the number one reason is if you've lost trust or faith in the criminal justice system, and you don't think you're going to get any benefit out of reporting. And so a lot of the fluctuation that we see is more about changes in reporting rates rather than changes in the underlying incidences that we see.
Yeah, and I mean the number of lives lost to gender-based violence as well, that remains staggering. How can all stakeholders work together to fight this scourge of crime? Because it's not only going to take the police.
Certainly, it isn't only the police. However, when you talk about the other kinds of interventions that have tended to work in other high crime and high violence places, like in South America, like the city of Bogota, it's absolutely essential that a certain base level of safety is there. Otherwise, your service delivery people, your social workers, they become too afraid to go into the areas which are very violent. And that's what we're increasingly seeing. Many parts of South Africa have become literally no-go areas for the kinds of service delivery that can really begin to work in partnership with crime fighting. And so the city of Bogota, for example, went from 70 per 100,000 murders down to 15. And how they did it was they combined district by district, street by street, accelerated policing with service delivery of various kinds, including paving roads, street lights, social work, identifying problems, and also negotiating with gangs to reduce the level of violence.
Mm-hmm. Is there enough being invested in crime intelligence? Because previously that's also been where the fingers are pointing at, that part of the reason why we're not seeing even the police's strategies succeeding in the way they intended to succeed is that not a lot of money is being invested into crime intelligence.
Yeah, so we have to remember that crime intelligence of the police was one of the key parts of the police that was completely captured during state capture, and was not only in terms of the money being used, being stolen and used for nefarious purposes, but close to 300 appointments were made of people who were not correct for the job. So it's been a long process to slowly get rid of the incorrect people who've been in crime intelligence and to slowly turn it around. And once an entity like that has been destroyed, it takes a very long time to turn it around and to get it functioning properly again. It's very hard to build something up. It's very easy to break it down. And so we're in this transition phase of slowly building up, and we're also in a climate of austerity. The budgets have been cut across all departments. There's unlikely to be significant monies for any entity over and above what they're already getting within the SAPS.
What about police informers in communities? Because there have been reports lately that the amount they get paid has actually been slashed. How does that then affect intelligence gathering in the communities? Because that's part of the bigger help that police get in fighting crime in their communities, by talking to people who may have some information.
So traditionally in South Africa, that through informers has been the way in which the detective service has worked. This has meant that we've tended not to build skills in other areas, and possibly more important than the amount of money that people get paid is whether or not they trust the police and whether or not they will be safe if they inform on criminals. And what we've unfortunately seen in South Africa is many witnesses and many whistleblowers actually not being safe, and so that is definitely part of the picture as well, which will be affecting that method of solving cases or of identifying crimes or finding weapons.
Dr. Jean Redpath, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation.